Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Hood. I'm based at the communications team at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science, and I'm really happy to welcome all of you to our second of several colloquia over this academic year on the topic of trusting science, where we hope to facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue around the social, political, and internal trust and distrust in science. And the colloquia will focus on a longue durée perspective and a local and global scale. And we hope from this to provide some inspiration for further discussion and research. Just a small bit of admin, we will be recording the talk for publishing online, but not the Q&A. So if you ask any questions at the end, you won't be recorded. And I'd just like to thank everyone at the Institute who's been involved in organising the colloquium. So our research group members, administration, the library team, and the rest of the communications team. So I'm very happy first to welcome Lisa Ahlers, who organised this session. She is the leader of our Lisa Meitner research group, China in the Global System of Science, and she will be introducing today's colloquium with Jessica Wang on states, knowledge and borders. Does trust make science international?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. The Lisa Meitner Research Group and of course the whole Max-Planck-Institut feels extremely happy to be able to welcome today's speaker, Jessica Wang, who is Professor of History at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She joins us from there now in the very early hours of the morning, and not least because of this fact, we are extremely happy that she can make it and was agreeing to share her research and thoughts with us today. Her areas of specialization, which are already impressively broad, I have to say, are the history of science and medicine, political theory, urban and social history, and the history of US foreign relations. And there are more, but these are maybe the core ones. She has worked at the University of British Columbia since 2006, after spending several years at UCLA's Department of History. Interestingly, but maybe relatively typical for historians of science, Jessica Wang initially did her undergraduate studies at Cornell University in chemistry and biology, before deciding to turn to the history of these disciplines, first at Cornell and then later at the MIT, where she earned her PhD in the Social Studies of Science and Technology program in 1995. I first came across her work when I read an article entitled Merton's Shadow: Perspectives on Science and Democracy since 1940, which was published in 1999 and which is related to the work of my research group here at the MPI, China in the Global System of Science, where we, going beyond the case of China, also take a more general and comparative perspective and try to extrapolate from theory building that is mainly from and for the 20th century on questions of science and political regimes today. But that's just a side note to explain why we had for a long time already been wanting to talk to her, and now we are even happier that we can do it in this wider arena together with all of you. But let's give some more background to her work. Professor Wang is the author of several books, of which I will only name two single-authored ones. You can find more of the titles, of course, in our virtual bookshelf that the fabulous library team has assembled for us online on our web pages. In 2019, Jessica Wang published Mad Dogs and Other New Yorkers, Rabies, Medicine and Society in an American Metropolis, 1840 to 1920, which is also available as an audiobook, I saw, but I would also recommend you to really take a look at the print version, because you can see it also has a lot of interesting illustrations of this phenomenon. And I'll read from the cover just one sentence: focusing on a transformative era in medicine, politics, and urban society, Wang uses rabies to survey urban social geography, the place of domesticated animals in the 19th century city, and the world of American medicine. 10 years earlier, Professor Wang in 1999 published a book called American Science in an Age of Anxiety, Scientists, Anti-Communism, and the Cold War. And I'll read again, this time from the blurbs. essential and rewarding reading for anyone wanting to understand the forces that shaped Cold War science, politics, and culture in the United States. So from these two titles, I think you can already see that she has a strong focus on the history of science in or of the United States. But there are many other publications that also go in additional directions and are targeting the more global sphere. And just a few examples of those. In 2005, she contributed a co-authored article on purges in comparative perspective, rules for exclusion and inclusion in the scientific community under political pressure. And that was for a special issue of Osiris. And I mentioned this because it was edited by Carola Sachse and Mark Walker. And the special issue was on politics and science in wartime, comparative international perspectives on the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and published in 2005, as I said. In 2015, she co-edited with John Cridge, Nation, Knowledge, and Imagined Futures, Science, Technology, and Nation Building, post-1945, a special issue of History and Technology. And in the same journal, together with Axel Janssen and John Cridge, she recently, in 2019, did a special issue on empires of knowledge, constructing global order in the 20th century. So against this background, when we invited her to lecture in this year's Institute's Colloquium, we initially had in mind a contribution that would compare, say, Cold War period with today, focusing on our key topic of trust, this time in international science cooperation. And she agreed to give the talk, which was already amazing. And then we were even more thrilled when she herself suggested to go back further in history to the early modern period, as you have probably seen in the abstract, in order to explore the political relationships that have conditioned international science and states' attention to the movement of scientific information, and that may actually be counteracting the norm of generalized trust in the scientific community that is so often assumed. In order to give her enough time to lay out this fascinating topic, we have decided that today's Institute's Colloquium has a bit more of a classical format again. We play with a variety of formats this year, ranging from roundtables to dialogues and more traditional lectures. So basically this time, Professor Wang's talk will be approximately 45 minutes we have planned, and then we can immediately open up for a general Q&A without a dedicated commentary. You can indicate that you have questions or comments in the chat box or by raising your hand, but I'll instruct you again later. So with this introduction, let me say, Professor Wang, we are so much looking forward to your talk, and we are very excited to have you here. And with this, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and also for the invitation in the first place, and all of your hard work in organizing this session and the entire series. I certainly appreciate the chance to be a part of this discussion. So I'm going to share my screen and see if I can start this slideshow. And yeah, and I just thank you all of you for coming, and I know this is not your normal meeting time either, so I appreciate the extra accommodation here. So the paper I'm going to present, the bulk of it actually comes from an essay that I've written for a volume that John Kriega is in the process of editing, and that should be coming out with University of Chicago this spring. And so when Anna proposed the topic for this session, you know, I already had a kind of longue durée in mind, and I decided for today to try and bring it up to the discussion up to some present day events as well, especially since the question of China and US-China relations and the place of China in global science is looming increasingly large these days, and is a part of an increasingly tense relationship between the United States and China. So And as you know from the title I've proposed here, I've proposed that question, does trust make science international? I think I would say up front that I'm not convinced that trust has a great deal to do with it, at least when it comes from the perspective of states and a long history of their efforts to regulate flows of knowledge. And so what I want to do is to try and outline a history from the early modern period to the present that speaks to two basic questions. The first question is simply how and when did science become international? And the second is, well, what kind of internationalism has defined scientific activities in different historical contexts? Now, in terms of the first question, there was a time when you could take the answer for granted. The 20th century origins of history of science as a discipline assumed that science was inherently international. And this question that I've posed simply made no sense whatsoever from that perspective. For example, George Sarton in 1913 in the journal ISIS, when he kind of launched the journal with a programmatic statement, he emphasized the international character of science and the role of science, therefore, as a resource for peace and for human betterment. Or several decades later, American physicists who fought for civilian and international control of atomic energy after World War II, they very confidently touted the internationalism and universalism of science as reasons to minimize secrecy and maximize information exchange. And of course, in terms of my own thinking about the history of science, and internationalism, I first became engaged with this question of scientific internationalism, starting with post-war physics many, many years ago, longer ago than I care to admit at this point. So that was, I think, the sort of once the standard line on scientific internationalism, that it was something inherent. It was part of what science was and is. But more recent scholarship has rejected these kinds of grand narratives of what science is in favor of more contextualized approaches. And these are approaches attuned to the ever-shifting and ever-contested status of knowledge and its relationship with power. Already in the 1970s, scholars such as Paul Foreman and Brigitte Schroeder-Gutehuis and others, I think they already sensed that science was hardly free from nationalist objectives, and they began to suggest the ways in which scientific nationalism and internationalism needed to be understood as operating hand in hand. And scholars increasingly in more recent years have accepted this kind of codependent relationship between nationalism and internationalism in science. Meanwhile, international and global historians, they've also been producing an increasingly sophisticated literature. This is a literature that interrogates the basic conceptual apparatus and configurations of political power that undergird the nation state form, the international system, and the fundamental nature of international relationships. And again, they also see a kind of co-production of the nation state and of the international sphere. So to understand the dynamics then of international science as both ideology and practice within the history of the international system as a whole, I think we need to move away from an openness-secrecy binary that associates smooth flows of knowledge across borders with a normative science that is premised on trust within a community based on shared values. We need to stop opposing that with an image of secrecy as the product of barriers imposed by, in particular, an aberrant post-World War II national security state. Rather, what I want to propose here is that international science and its emphasis on collaboration and exchange, it needs to be understood as a product of what is really historically a very tangled relationship between the state and science. And this is a relationship that constantly shifted and pivoted in response to changes in the international system, as well as states' associated priorities within that system. And I think we can see these dynamics at work best if we look at more of a longue durée. And so to do that, I want to proceed as follows. First, I will start in the early modern period. I have two brief snapshots of early modern science as a way to try and outline regimes of knowledge that were based on imperial powers' efforts to monopolize information and natural objects. And I think this history suggests that far from being incompatible with science, state-sponsored demands for secrecy were an established part of what, in the 16th century and on into the 17th, were a social order that defined, there was an established social order that defined scientific inquiry in the early modern period. And then second, I want to look at the uneasy coexistence between cross-border communications and collaborations on the one hand, and states' efforts to preserve their respective informational advantages on the other throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, or rather on into the early 19th century. And then third, I want to focus on the era of the so-called Long Peace of 1815 to 1914, because I think this is the era in which a new and self-conscious age of internationalism in scientific relations, this new age of scientific internationalism, it grew out of a new era of internationalism in international affairs more broadly. And we should also keep in mind that this realm of international affairs was also inter-imperial in character. And then finally, I want to consider the contested space of scientific internationalism and the politics of science in the United States from the end of World War II to the present before I will attempt to draw some conclusions. So first of all, we start in the early modern period. And this is a period in which state-sponsored secrecy evolved within a historical context in which inquiries into the natural world were defined by cultures of secrecy and not norms of exchange. So here I have in mind the sort of early modern occult philosophy and its cultural outlook. That was an outlook that associated value and status with secrecy and with the power of mystery. This is also a time period, and this of course continues until much later as well, that it was a period of craft traditions that emphasized the protection of information and knowledge so that guilds could control the privilege of entry into skilled trades. So within this cultural context, states and their efforts to control information for instrumental purposes, states were hardly aberrational in cultural settings that deliberately shrouded knowledge and nature with a sense of mystery or jealously guarded trade secrets. And then imperial objectives also strongly conditioned states' interests in guarding information. And so where knowledge meant competitive advantages, imperial powers sought to defend the exclusivity of information and access to valuable goods. And we can see the priority accorded to secrecy and the protection of knowledge about the New World in studies of science in the 16th century Spanish Empire, for example. Alison Sandman, to just give one example, she's written a well-known essay on cartography and the high premium that Spanish imperial officialdom placed on navigational and cartographical secrecy. And this was a time period in which there was this whole welter of rules and laws that oversaw the licensing of pilots and that mandated prohibitions against their sharing information with foreigners. Or the history of the Spanish monarchy's efforts to control cosmographical knowledge. And this has been elaborated upon really beautifully by Maria M. Portuondo in her very close and incisive study of institutions and Spanish cosmography. Her study shows how in an era of intense inter-imperial rivalries, particularly with the British, the Spanish monarchy worked hard to try and defend navigational, cartographical, hydrographical, and natural historical information that, from its perspective, constituted state secrets that were critical to the interests of the crown. And the monarchy did so through a virtual state monopoly on the production of cartographic materials, such as the map you see before you. There were demands that the Council of Indies maintain control over maps and rudders from recent expeditions. The Crown also used book bans and other forms of censorship to try and restrict information flows. So I think 16th century Spanish cosmography, then, it gives us a very telling example of how, at least at times, states erected elaborate legal and bureaucratic architectures around information about the natural world. They did this centuries before the much more familiar, at least to me, mid-20th century era of security clearances and classified information. Now, admittedly, early modern states never controlled information as tightly as they would have liked. I think this is actually true of 20th century states as well, and we'll return to this point in a little bit. What matters for the moment, I think, though, is the aspirational quality of state secrecy and how it guided institutional practices that sought to subject the flow of information about the natural world to the discretion of the state. And then 17th and 18th century botanical endeavors. These give us another perspective on secrecy and monopolization as efforts that surrounded scientific knowledge and its relationship to state power and empire. So the 17th and 18th centuries, this was a time period of intense state-sponsored efforts and also colonial violence tied to the identification and development of plant resources. It was a period of intense competition between imperial powers and efforts to defend. It was an era of efforts to defend or break monopolies on botanical resources. And states attempted to defend monopolies by implementing legal prohibitions on the exportation of critical plant species or by outright denying to ambitious naturalists entry into colonial possessions. Alexander von Humboldt, for example, he very famously, he never made it to British India because the British East India Company, which was very conscious of his French patronage, the British East India Company repeatedly refused him permission to travel there. His famous 5-year sojourn in South America from 1799 to 1804 was also somewhat surprising in that the Spanish crown granted him permission for his expedition. Mary Louise Pratt has written that this was a particular moment of liberal reform in Spain, but nonetheless, the royal permission surprised contemporary Spanish observers. And I think their surprise should give us a clue as to the normative quality of Spanish efforts to try and close off the New World colonies to foreign competitors. So this is a highly competitive era. That sense of competition was expressed in imperial powers and a rush to claim and hold territories abroad. Competition was also expressed in theft as a kind of time-honored means of trying to acquire and exploit new plant species. These were, these competitive attempts to break monopolies of valuable botanical commodities. For example, in the early 18th century, La Condamine, he stole cinchona and rubber seedlings, and he did so despite the very watchful presence of Spanish minders during his expedition to the interior of Spanish Peru. It was only the failure of his seeds to propagate when he got back to France that's what kept Spain's botanical monopoly intact over these commodities. Or much later, we can point to the British Empire's penetration of China's tea monopoly and the botanical theft that made tea production in British India possible in the 19th century. Or there's Henry Wickham's famous success in smuggling 70,000 rubber seeds out of Brazil in the 1870s after a long history of failed attempts to acquire and spread rubber. And so all of colonial rubber production in Southeast Asia, it comes out of botanical theft in the late 19th century. So we could think of a kind of botanical arms race at work. And this arms race, it also took place within a long 18th century of rivalries and recurrent warfare amongst England, France, and Spain prior to the stabilization of continental relations that came with the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And frequent military conflicts in this time period also offered ample opportunities for botanical piracy. Just to give one quick example, during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, American correspondents who had met Humboldt because he was in America in the after South America and swing tour. American correspondents who were seeking to curry favor with Humboldt, they were worried about, well, how are they going to send specimens across the Atlantic during a time of war, however? This was a time that, the American naturalist and artist Charles Wilson Peale, he labeled it a time of what he called plundering warships and privateers. And that was going to make it very hard to send any biological specimens to Europe. And that made it better to wait, he said, until better times. And then more generally, just the frequency with which colonial territorial holdings changed hands from the 17th to the early 19th centuries, whether as a result of changing diplomatic alliances or peace agreements, this also reshaped the imperial botanical landscape and access to valuable commodities. On the whole, the kind of geopolitical machinations of European power very powerfully shaped botany as an object of intense competition for natural resources, for economic opportunities, and for imperial advantage. But then I think, the obvious question here is, well, but what about the Republic of Letters? How can you kind of build an image of an era as an era of secrecy when this is also the time of the Republic of Letters? And so, this drive for monopolization, it was hardly complete. And one has to understand how within a competitive global order, networks of correspondence and exchange also coexisted in this uneasy balance between secrecy and openness. So, courteous forms of interchange through correspondence between learned individuals, these gradually gained social and institutional form in the late 17th and 18th century Republic of Letters. And this established a kind of ethos of interchange among self-identified cosmopolitans who prized an ideal of open exchange without regard for national borders, even if in practice, those exchanges may have actually been somewhat more limited. Just to give one example, even as warfare in the early 1800s hampered botanical acquisitions, the American physician, naturalist, and botanical collector David Hosack, he very eagerly exploited his correspondence network to acquire living plants from all over the world. He did so through French and British connections, and he raised these plants in an elaborate greenhouse that he hoped would become the basis for a national botanical collection that would bolster the US nation-building project in the early 19th century. And then at the same time, also, though, one has to remember, it's not just the Republic of Letters. States' commitment to secrecy was far from complete. And under the right circumstances, states also endorsed openness over secrecy. For example, governments were sometimes more willing to grant access to their colonies when requests came from nationals whom they did not perceive as dangerous rivals. This was the case with Linnaeus' student Pericles, for example, who was able to make arrangements for his North American explorations in the midst of King George's War from 1744 to 48, in part because of finely tuned Swedish diplomacy, and in part because of the strength of Linnaeus's own correspondence networks with naturalists in England and in British North America. We should also remember that active warfare did not necessarily preclude official endorsement of international scientific endeavors. So in addition to the correspondence networks that persisted during times of war, more dramatically, states also sometimes mandated official protection for traveling savants in the midst of hostilities. One can consider the example of the transits of Venus of 1761 and 1769, for which the Republic of Letters sort of enrolled hundreds of savants to take measurements. With the 7 Years' War still in force during the first transit, the British nonetheless granted at least one set of French astronomical travelers safe passage. Or when Anglo-French warfare broke out yet again in 1778, the French government took a certain amount of care to carve out a zone of exception for Captain Cook's third voyage. And it even directed French ports to provide Cook with all necessary aid despite the war. It did so in recognition of him as, and this is how the order read, as a man whose work interests all nations. So these kinds of episodes, they suggest how states at times attempted to build cultural capital by demonstrating their magnanimity towards science during times of war. And one also has to remember the notional quality of colonial political authority at work as well, which that kept knowledge and specimens beyond the tight control of imperial regulation. So this is where what I was hinting at earlier, that as much as states sometimes sought monopolization and secrecy, their power to enforce it was often quite limited. For example, the historian Cameron Strain has done a recent study of the American Gulf South from the 16th to the early 19th century. And what his study shows is just how fuzzy and ever shifting borders were in the region. And because of that, you had this region with fuzzy borders and also loose political allegiances among ambitious naturalist explorers. And those realities tended to thwart ambitions for monopolization, particularly as Spanish power itself weakened in the region and was ultimately replaced by the United States. And so, as much as empires sought to protect their cartographical and botanical resources, even in the absence of outright theft or espionage, knowledge about the natural world just kind of leaked through difficult to enforce barriers. And as exclusive control over facts or access to botanical goods faded, well, what did states do? From the perspective of states, the advantages of openness began to outweigh those of the advantages that secrecy offered. And here we can go back again to Maria Portuando's study of Spanish cosmography, which is very instructive on this point, because she finds that by the end of the 16th century, as the success of English raids compromised Spain's regime of secrecy surrounding detailed cartographical information, publicity became more useful as a means of giving royal patrons an occasion to demonstrate their stature. And in the absence of monopolies on information, revelation also showcased Spain's geopolitical prowess and helped to bolster its territorial claims. So constantly the release of previously secret information, as Portuondo writes, I quote here, became one of the tools through which the Spanish monarchy announced to the world the extent of its empire. And thus cosmography ceased to be the secret science of the Spanish Empire. Or we can turn to botany on this point very briefly and go back to Lucille Brockway's classic study of Kew Gardens in the 19th century, which also kind of gives us insights about the forms of collaboration that existed alongside inter-imperial competition. And she gives us insight into the circumstances in which it made sense for imperial powers to trade botanical information as well as plant varieties. So, for example, she documented some prominent instances of British and Dutch inter-imperial collaboration in the cases of cinchona and rubber during the second half of the 19th century. And close correspondence between British and Dutch colonial experts in India and Java, respectively. This correspondence helped to identify the highest yielding varieties of cinchona. And this was a collaboration aided by the different political economies that grew around cinchona, because for the British, they mainly wanted quinine in order to protect British troops in India, and they conceded its commercial development for a global market to the Dutch. So scientific exchange, I would suggest, it constitutes a kind of historical conundrum precisely because knowledge production relies upon communities' accumulated experience and ideas, yet it also offers instrumental and material advantages that at times encourage secrecy. And an imperial age that offered European powers novel resources from places yet unknown to each other, this age provided ample opportunities to try and maintain monopolies, particularly within a context of frequent European warfare from the late 17th to the early 19th centuries. Nonetheless, knowledge crossed national and imperial borders. But this isn't because ideas somehow want to circulate. This is a point that John Krieger has emphasized in his recent work. But knowledge flows because human circumstances conspire to facilitate exchanges. And they did so historically, whether on the part of elite communities or under direct state sponsorship. And these impulses, they gained more formal, institutionalized, and state-sponsored forms with the so-called Law and Peace of the period after 1815. So when it comes to the scientific internationalism that sort of we know well as historians, historical discussions of the rise of a novel age of internationalism in which intellectuals and government officials and reformers saw themselves as living in a newly modern and international age, these discussions usually start with the 1850s, this decade that launched an era of international congresses made possible by a technological revolution in steam-powered transportation and telegraphic communications that eased travel and cross-border discussions. So that's the usual narrative. It has its attractions, but I think it underestimates the significance of earlier geopolitical developments, namely the Congress of Vienna as the precondition for large-scale interstate collaborations on projects of measurement a little bit earlier in the 1830s and 1840s. So the relative stability and peace on the European continent from 1815 until the order-shattering violence of World War I, this contrasted quite significantly with the bouts of frequent military conflict between empires from 1688 until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And relative stability and respect for balance of power, it also allowed empires to expand without undue interference from each other and to consolidate power through collaborative arrangements. The 1884-85 Berlin Conference and European colonizers' effort to legitimate imperial borders through the negotiated partitioning of the African continent is one sort of classic example of this inter-imperial collaboration at work. Or in the early 20th century, we could point to, say, Theodore Roosevelt's so-called Roosevelt Corollary of 1904-05, which famously called for what Roosevelt labeled an international police power. This was a vision in which he hoped that imperial powers would oversee political order and the enforcement of financial obligations in their respective spheres of influence for what he thought of as the supposed benefit of all. So from this standpoint, internationalism and cooperative international institutions, they developed, not as just a simple expression of uncomplicated cosmopolitan values growing out of the Republic of Letters tradition, but internationalism and cooperative institutions, including international science, also developed simultaneously as means for empires to contain their tendencies towards conflict and thereby sustain a global order that was friendly to imperial aspiration. And so in the century prior to World War I, scientific internationalism evolved within a broader apparatus of inter-imperial collaboration and a diplomacy of empire that sustained high imperialism in the first place. So with that in mind, I think discussions of 19th century scientific internationalism should actually start with the cooperative ventures in the geosciences from the 1830s onward, and not with the era of international congresses of the second half of the century. If you look closely at these projects, nationalist ambitions certainly abounded in 1830s and 40s geoscience, but these projects also took place within a context and a setting of dramatically reduced interstate violence between imperial powers. And as a result, post-Vienna stability, it reinvigorated state-sponsored exploration and naval collection of magnetic data, for example, that was needed for improved navigation and better determination of longitude at sea. In Britain and other countries, they mounted new expeditions in the 1820s, and then in the 1830s, they established cooperative efforts to try and coordinate observations and share data. This took the form of the Magnetische Verein of 1834 to 38, and its network of observatories set up across Northern Europe and Russia. This was followed by Britain's own magnetic crusade, which was launched in 1838, and which included international partners arranged through 6 other European governments, as well as university-based collaborators in the United States. And then other joint projects of measurement and data gathering followed, and these also promised mutual benefits in an era of reduced international tensions. For example, the British Admiralty in 1835 had a project on tidal measurements. This was a project that brought together 9 countries and their respective colonial possessions in order to coordinate the timed data gathering that was required in hundreds of locales. Or one could think about the joint efforts of Great Britain, the United States, and transatlantic cable companies in the 1860s to use telegraphy to increase the accuracy of longitude determination and thereby fulfill hopes of safer navigation. That also in the 19th century, the British and American zeal for data collection and chart making and publication of charts, to go back, this echoes yet again Portuando's point. These kinds of efforts also provided a means of demonstrating national prowess and projecting power over the ocean. So scientific exchanges in the geosciences and oceanography, they didn't connote the absence of national rivalries, but rather they expressed those rivalries as suited to 19th century geopolitical conditions, namely in the form of these collaborative endeavors. The more familiar internationalism of international scientific conferences and new international committees followed along in the second half of the 19th century, along with an expanded array of cooperative efforts. So international scientific committees, they began to meet in order to negotiate common nomenclature and other forms of standardization that were necessary to facilitate flows of knowledge. And where states had compelling commercial interests in facilitating international business and trade, international scientific projects of standardization, they also proceeded with urgency and with official oversight, as in the International Congress on Metric Standards of 1875, or the multiple meetings of the International Electrical Congress that convened in the 1880s and 1890s to establish electrical standards. One could also think about tropical medicine and tropical agriculture as fields that embodied common imperial interests. So these were fields in which information exchange promised to solidify colonial projects more generally, and these were disciplines that flourished in an era of imperial internationalism. The rise of international public health, starting with the first International Sanitary Conference in 1851 and culminating in the early post-World War I period in the League of Nations reporting apparatus to monitor the spread of international disease outbreaks. This work of international public health, it also symbolized this new sense of interdependence that self-identified internationalists in the 19th and early 20th centuries associated with modernity itself. And it was that sense of interdependence as part of the condition of modernity that fueled internationalist political commitments in the early decades of the 20th century. Now, scholars have frequently viewed the new era of international congresses and scientific unions in terms of scientists' self-organization, an evolving international civil society, and a new consciousness among reformers and intellectuals about the interdependence of modern life and the progressive possibilities of modernity itself. And these trends came together as an explicitly named internationalism. So this is a historical actor's term that this explicitly named internationalism emerged in the 1860s from earlier pacifist and cosmopolitan currents. At the same time, though, again, one has to remember the role of states here, that these congresses also served as a vehicle for states to realize their mutual interests through the technical administrative functions that so many of these new organizations served, and not just broader humanitarian projects, as in the organized peace movement or the aid work of the Red Cross. So well before the era of the League of Nations and its affiliated organizations, much less the post-World War II world of the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, well before either of those, problems of standardization helped to bring out transnational epistemic communities of experts, such as the scientists, civil servants who were instrumental in carrying out the work of the Meter Treaty of 1875. And I think here I'm relying on Martin Geyer's work. And his emphasis on scientists' dual role as experts and as civil servants, it reinforces a key intervention by another scholar, Madeline Herron, who has emphasized the critical role that formal government representation played in the age of conferencing. That this 19th century era of conferencing, it's not just experts getting together on their own, but there is formal government representation at pretty much all of these major international congresses. So scientific congresses did not just connote international science as a form of voluntary association across borders, but it also connoted states and their representatives, in particular civil servants, and how they had significant interests and roles to play in these kinds of gatherings. For example, Valeska Huber has pointed out that, I think it's at the second International Sanitary Conference, that they actually, they kick out the scientific experts and they say, this meeting's for the diplomats because, the scientists, they're just going to get in the way of the kind of diplomatic agreements we need to iron out at this particular gathering. So it's through these kinds of collaborations that emerged the administrative, legal, and organizational apparatuses for dealing with a wide range of needs generated by interstate relations. And a lot of these needs were scientific or technical in nature, in the areas of public health and sanitation, agreement on the prime meridian and other geodetic matters, standardization of weights and measures was always another key priority. So the scientific internationalism of the late 19th and early 20th century, then, I think we should think of it as evolving not just as a result of progressive and egalitarian commitments to the universality of knowledge and its service to the common good, nor should we think of it as only a product of transnational epistemic communities and their professionalization. But we also have to understand the emergence of scientific internationalism as a pragmatic realm of interstate practice that was designed for an era of increasingly globalized and interdependent commercial relations. Now, as the above overview suggests, so I've gone through about 400 years of history in about 38 minutes, states and epistemic communities have been negotiating and renegotiating over the flow of scientific knowledge across borders for centuries. But within this history, the state has operated not just as the ever vigilant defender of secrecy, but rather, depending on geopolitical circumstances, states have also embraced opportunities for international cooperation on scientific matters. And in the mid-1920s, states' internationalist leanings even outpaced those of scientific institutions. As Brigitte Schroeder-Gutehuis has pointed out, during the post-World War I Cold War in science, it was governments that were actually quicker to try to reintegrate Germany into the community of nations in the second half of the 1920s than scientific organizations. That scientific organizations were still kind of caught up in debates about whether or not to lift sanctions against German science. And then in the United States, World War II and the post-war national security state also produced a new and intricate relationship between physics and the state. And it produced an increasingly complex bureaucratic apparatus surrounding the regulation of scientific and technical knowledge. In a Cold War geopolitical order organized around the bipolar competition of US-Soviet relations, followed by a post-Cold War world now increasingly defined by this point by US-China tensions within an unstable multipolar order, governmental efforts to regulate scientific exchange have grown ever more visible during this era. So the post-World War II world of security clearances and loyalty investigations that I first read about many years ago, this constitutes one aspect of the early Cold War order, and its legacy has continued to the present day, particularly over the past 20 plus years, with growing attention to Chinese American scientists and suspicions of their scientific relationships with Chinese institutions that in the post-Cold War era became sort of starkly visible with congressional Republicans' investigations in the late 1990s and the report of the Cox Committee in 1999 is pictured to the left. And as with the 1940s, the 1990s investigations also featured kind of inflated estimates of high-tech secrets that were supposedly lost to China. They also featured aspersions cast on Chinese American scientists' loyalty. And these kinds of, charges and forms of stigma circulated even as some prominent prosecutions completely unraveled or mostly unraveled. And the Wenho Lee case was the first that was sort of first most visible case of what has become an increasingly common phenomenon in recent years. So, prosecutions and their effect on the US scientific community continue to make headlines. And so the two images to the left here are from the New York Times on November 28th, so just a couple of weeks ago. The two on the right are from Nature at the end of October. And at present, scientists today who are interested in collaboration with research partners in China or with scientific partners abroad, and in particular in other countries where US relations are tense, they find themselves under really, I would say, as much pressure or more pressure than during the height of the Cold War. And the problem here, partly it's the geopolitical issue of China's rise to power. Partly one could talk about the racism in the United States that makes Asian Americans into, what scholars call perpetual foreigners. But the issue doesn't just arise from these circumstances. It's also a problem of a legal and regulatory architecture surrounding a very vexed category. This is the category of information that is sensitive but unclassified. So John Krieger and Mario Daniels have done some really great work on this problem in recent years, and they have a book that is about to come out, I think, at any moment. They've traced the origins of efforts to control exports of unclassified yet sensitive technological information all the way back to the late 1940s with the rise of the Export Control Act of 1949. And over time, this category of sensitive but unclassified has just evolved into a whole host of post-Cold War regulations. And these regulations, also coupled together with post-9/11 visa rules, they basically created just a bureaucratic nightmare in the United States for scientists and universities. And so as John Krieger has described in his recent writings, these problems include just a whole tangle of laborious monitoring and reporting requirements about foreign students and foreign visitors' general activities and access to technology and data. This is a regulatory regime that is so legally and bureaucratically arcane that it's actually difficult to know exactly how to follow the rules. But if one violates these rules, however inadvertently, there is the threat of potential fines or imprisonment that, this can mean the loss of research dollars for institutions, and it can mean personal ruin for individuals. And moreover, this is a regulatory environment that I would suggest, it to a certain extent creates its own realities, because the creation of new categories of sensitive but unclassified information has created new categories of danger and intrigue for the national security state to police. For example, in 1996, a then little noticed law called the Economic Espionage Act, it escalated the sharing of trade secrets to federal criminal offense if committed in order to aid a foreign power. Now, previously, these violations, in most cases, they'd just been a civil rather than a criminal offense. And this was only under state level statutes and not US federal law. But what the 1996 Act accomplished was a kind of juridical sleight of hand. It expanded the number of security threats in the post-Cold War world simply through the legal redefinition of some forms of larceny that, earlier they had just been straightforward theft of intellectual property, and they were part of the realm of tort law. But now they're redefined as a form of espionage with all of the heightened sense of betrayal of state and nation that the term implies. So what kinds of conclusions can we draw from this long history that I've tried to outline? I think, as I indicated at the start, historical scholarship has steadily moved away from a kind of mid-20th century confidence in the inherently international character of science and its roots in a kind of uncomplicated universalism. And attention to the changing social and political contexts that have shaped scientific pursuits across long periods of time. If you pay attention to those longer term trends and flows, they underscore the constant processes of adjustment and balance between different parties and among competing priorities that, have always defined scientific inquiry, or at least, if not always, at least over the last 500 years, which is sufficient as a time period for me anyway. And states and epistemic communities together, they navigated with varying degrees of common purpose and conflict, the push and pull of secrecy and openness, of nationalism and internationalism, and of imperialism and egalitarianism. And moreover, these kinds of binary categories, they are not themselves irreconcilable opposites. But these binaries of, say, national and international, they involve fuzzy categories that are able to encompass wide-ranging and contradictory meanings that I think require one to contend with not just multiple modernities, which is a kind of popular phrase, but also multiple nationalisms and multiple internationalisms as well, along with the co-productions between these phenomena, which all, I think, altogether complicates any effort to try and get a handle on the nature of internationalism in science. Now, does trust have a place in this analysis? I do find trust kind of elusive as a means of explaining anything at the level of geopolitics. The old Reagan era mantra of doveriai no proveriai, or trust but verify. For example, I think that phrase really suggested that ultimately international agreements don't have to rest on trust at all. They rest on verification. Although I think you could perhaps one could say there's something sort of curiously Popperian in Reagan's famous phrase that may or may not be worth further comment. But for international affairs, the question might not be so much one of how to increase trust between states, but how otherwise, what other mechanisms are there to maintain states' interest in scientific cooperation? So I think my analysis today has also, it's moved away from any notion of the inherent internationalism of science itself as a collective enterprise. And I think, there are not that many historians today who are discomfited by the idea that the historic ebbs and flows of science and state power and the pathways through which knowledge moves, with their ever-changing currents and eddies, that these defy any attempt to identify essentialisms in the nature of science. That, our generation of scholars is not very devoted, I think, to the notion of essentialisms any longer. So in that sense, science is as national and international as states and societies and epistemic communities need it to be, through their mutual negotiations and antagonistic dealings. And these negotiations take place within geopolitical settings that themselves contribute to choices about secrecy and openness. But that's not to say that internationalism in science doesn't matter. Rather, it's to say quite the opposite, that it matters precisely because the internationalism is always negotiated, the stakes are high. if science were inherently open and free and international, well, complacency would then be rewarded if that were true, because that would just be the essence of science, and no one would have to really do anything to maintain that internationalism. But life has, historically never been so simple. It's certainly not that simple at present. And there are some hard-fought political battles that are being waged, that need to be waged today, therefore, over the transnational movement of knowledge and over international science. And so that's where I will conclude. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for this fascinating lecture. We know it came at a very busy time. Just gave a keynote at the History of Economic Society conference last weekend, and you talked to us in the very, very early hours of the morning. And I just hope you got some sleep beforehand. So let's really thank you for that. Again, thanks to all of you for your intriguing questions. And now for the remaining seconds, I hand over to Pablo for the announcement of our next session. And I can even try to share a background slide for that.
Yeah. So thank you, Anna. Yeah, I'm very glad to announce that the slide isn't
like that.
That's today, I think.
Right here.
There you go. So our next colloquium talk will be given by Philip Mirowski from the University of Notre Dame. He will be telling us about platform capitalism and the ways in which it might or might not be transforming science, and whether the resulting kind of science would be worth trusting or not. So if you're concerned that open science might do to science what Facebook did to democracy and journalism, then you should tune in. And with that, I'll just leave everyone to conclude for this session. Looking forward to the next one, though.
Thanks, Pablo. Yeah, thanks again. I can only hope we get Jessica here at some later point in normal times again to continue our conversation. And I'm looking forward to our next event. Have a nice evening. And of course, a good holiday time. See you again next year.